The U.S. and Iran are holding a pivotal third round of talks in Geneva today in what many consider a last-ditch effort to stave off U.S. military action. Washington has focused the talks on Iran's nuclear program, but at times suggested that limits on its ballistic missiles and support for so-called proxies in the region are necessary to reach a deal. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'm with Rose Kelanic. She directs the Middle East program at Defense Priorities and has a new explainer out where she argues that the U.S. should keep these talks focused on nuclear issues. Here are three things you need to know. Hey, Rose, how are you? Thanks for chatting with me today.
I'm great, Adam. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So, can you start off by just breaking down the state of play of these talks and how both sides see the major issues that I laid out in the intro?
Sure. Well, as we speak, the talks are still going on in Geneva, which is a good sign. The talks in the last round ended pretty quickly, which many people interpreted as a negative sign. So it's a good thing that they're still talking. Iran has gone into these talks trying to telegraph in every way that it can that it's willing to make concessions on its nuclear program, but it's not willing to make concessions on ballistic missiles or on support for regional terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The United States' position is much less clear than that. Donald Trump has said that the United States can never allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. But what that entails in terms of exact limits on its program isn't clear. And then there's also been discussion about whether missiles and proxy groups should be included in the talks or not. And where American red lines are just has not been established at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's been very confusing to follow. So, can you sort of get into the meat of your explainer that I referenced and talk about why you think it's important for U.S. interests to keep these talks focused solely on the nuclear issues?
Yeah, so I think that the nuclear issue is the place where, uh, an agreement is both most attainable and most valuable. If Iran went nuclear, it would not be the end of the world for the United States. Iran is not a major threat to the United States. It can't reach the United States militarily in any way, shape, or form. That said, the US has an interest in preventing nuclear proliferation by any country, including Iran. And if the US wants to achieve that, to prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, the best way to do it is with a diplomatic arrangement that has inspectors from the IAEA come to Iran and monitor and verify that they're complying with the limits of the deal. Um, on the other hand, the missiles question and the terrorist groups question are different issues. So for Iran, those are two of its main deterrents.
Right.
Iran is a weak country, much weaker than the United States or Israel. It can't afford missile defense. It can't afford an air force. So its way of deterring threats is to have this missile program where it could potentially retaliate against the United States bases in the region and against Israel. It's not going to give up that retaliation capability because if it did, it would essentially be defenseless. The terrorist group side of things, Iranian support for terrorists is repugnant and awful. It's not a reason why the United States should go to war with Iran.
Right.
And it's also the case that these terrorist groups they weren't created by Iran. They exist for their own purposes. And they do have some agency here. So even if Iran stopped supporting them tomorrow, Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis would not just cease to exist. They also don't target United States targets by and large, and can't hit anywhere outside the region either.
Yeah, one part of your explainer that I thought was really interesting was how you talked about if there was to be some deal related to these so-called proxies, how could the U.S. verify that support for them had ceased in any way? So, ultimately,
Yeah.
what does the U.S. do here if it can't reach a deal on these nuclear issues? What would be best for U.S. interest in this situation?
I mean, the overarching imperative for US interests is not to get into another forever war in the Middle East. And I would say, as a secondary imperative, not to even get into a small war in the Middle East. I think there's an understanding or a belief in the Trump administration that maybe if the US has a limited strike on Iran, it could get stronger negotiations from them in the talks in Geneva and elsewhere. But of course, if we strike Iran at all, it's very possible that they'll retaliate and could kill U.S. troops in the region. And ultimately, as much as it would be better for the world if Iran didn't get nuclear weapons, fighting a war over this issue is much worse than than having Iran maintain a nuclear program, frankly. It's like the cure is worse than the disease if the cure is a war in the region. So Iran can't hit the United States, and the only reason that we are having this standoff is because the Trump administration brought the standoff to Iran, right? They chose to create this confrontation. And it might be somewhat embarrassing for Trump if then he pulls the United States back. But the much better thing to do than to fight a war just because you're backed into a corner and you want to maintain some sense of credibility, right? You shouldn't fight wars for credibility. You shouldn't risk US lives just to save face, right? And so the far better thing is to dial down the pressure and move on to something else. We shouldn't be in this place in the first place, but since we are here, that's ultimately what we have to keep in our minds.
Yeah, I've heard you refer to Trump as a political escape artist a few times. So maybe if there's anybody who could back down in a situation like this, it would be him. Well, thanks for joining me today, Rose. And I want to encourage everybody to visit Defense Priorities and check out your explainer and all the great content that we're producing on this Iran issue.